Welcome, everyone, to Real Estate 360 Live. I'm your host, Ryan Sloper. For those of you not familiar with the program, my guests and I will cover every angle of real estate, from interest rates to the economy to what's happening in Washington. Anything that affects our local real estate markets will be covered here. If you got credit issues and you're struggling to get approved for a loan to potentially buy your first home or a move-up home, and your credit's hindering you due to collections or bankruptcies in the past, stuff that hasn't been cleaned up, we're here to guide you in the right direction to get you back on a path to home ownership. If you're looking to find a lender to refinance the lowest rates in U.S. history, we've actually just recently seen the Freddie Mac survey that we've had 12 consecutive months now of interest rates under 4%. We'd like to give you to a reputable lender that can handle your refinance or purchase transaction that's not going to not explain the nitty-gritty details that you need and have any surprises at the closing table. If you would like to reach out to us at any point with any questions you may have, the best number to reach us on is the off-air phone number, which is 877-245-2030. That's 877-245-2030. Or you can visit us via the web at realestate360live.com. That's realestate360live.com. That's where you listeners go. On the right-hand side, there's an Ask a Question button. At any time you have any pressing questions, concerns in regards to real estate, mortgages, credit, you just enter in your name and email, and we'll be getting back to you, probably same business day. Remember, if it's real estate, it's covered here. Make sure that you're joining us every Monday at 1580 a.m. from 9 to 10 a.m. in the morning. And if it's real estate, it's covered here. We've got a great show lined up for you guys today. Joining me on our panel to discuss the many issues of the markets is Louis Cammarosano, who is the general manager of HomeGain. Louis is often cited in the media as an industry expert in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, CNN Money, Fox Business, Smart Money, MSN, and numerous others. We're going to discuss with you what happened in the markets last week, as well as what's on deck this week that can affect you and your real estate decisions. Louis, are you there, buddy?
I am. Good morning, Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing well, Louis. How are you today?
I'm grand. Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. And, I wanted to start the show. Obviously, last week we were discussing basically the markets and our government. Everything that's been talked about in the media over the last week or 2 weeks has been completely dominated by the fiscal cliff that we're facing. You and I obviously have our thoughts about, what's going to happen, what's going to transpire. Really, they're just going to keep kicking the can down the road as they had before. But I think that there was something interesting that took place the other day, which was Treasury Secretary Geithner floating out there that he would like to potentially see Obama have basically be able to unilaterally raise the debt ceiling. And I thought that was quite interesting because it would just allow for this scheme to continue on much easier than it is now. What are your thoughts on that, and what do you think he was trying to accomplish by floating that out there?
Well, putting politics aside, first of all, it's unconstitutional because the Congress is supposed to determine the level of spending. The issue has been that the Congress has uniformly and traditionally just raised the debt ceiling each and every time they come up against it, so it's almost like a pro forma exercise. Except last time, a year and a half ago, there was a great debate over whether to raise it or not. It looked like perhaps they wouldn't raise it and the U.S. might default. And what happened was, I think Senator McConnell is the one who actually recommended that little concept that you hand it over to the president, which again would be an abdication of Congress's authority to control the purse strings. So I think what you're seeing, though, is all politicians do not want the responsibility of spending money responsibly. They just want to be able to say that their programs weren't cut, and let's continue with the spending. And all right, we'll blame the president because he raised it, and it's not our fault. And we would have been fiscally responsible, but the president went ahead and did it. So it really is a splendid mess.
Yeah, and for those
even
of you really,
even when you get even that concept that they would actually even think that you would hand it over to the president, means that no one's really interested in solving this.
Yeah, well, I believe it was the Senate Minority Whip John Cornyn who basically came out and said that this is ridiculous. It's profoundly irresponsible, and it's a crazy idea, and that he's amazed that the Geithner had the courage to float that out there, and other and other people in Congress as well. I find rather ironic that in searching on the internet lately and listening to conversations that I'm having with people, Facebook, everywhere, it seems like everyone has all of a sudden become completely enamored with this whole fiscal cliff. And my thoughts are, why weren't we having these same discussions pre-election? We've now gone through the election, and now everybody's worried about it again, when this should have been the sticking point in the election. You know what I mean? It should have been the one thing that got talked about, got the most play, yet it didn't get hardly anything. And yet we're right back in the same place that we were, and hoping for a different result. And it just seems like it's going to be much of the same. They like you said, I mean, all Congress really cares is that their programs aren't cut, that their that their retirement and pensions aren't cut, and that they'll continue to be able to do business as usual. And, they're going to end up having to cut some programs, but it's probably not going to be to the extent that people are thinking. We're going to continue to further devalue the dollar. I mean, for those of you not really familiar with the term fiscal cliff, basically the cliff is just a term that's used to describe the automatic spending cuts and tax increases that would be triggered, basically a failure of Congress to act on the deficit reduction plan, which, they've shown time after time that they like to push things down to the wire. I would anticipate, there's not been many negotiations back and forth of anything that's made any headway so far. I would see that this pretty much going up to the end of the year, at which time they'd probably just have to say they'll either get something done or, I don't know what they'll do. What are you thinking that's going to transpire between now and the end of the year and the beginning of the year? Anything, Louis?
Well, what they might do is, assuming they do go off the fiscal cliff, so to speak, and the automatic spending cuts kick in and the tax increases rise, they'll find a way to avoid that as well. What they'll do is they will make sure that the IRS doesn't take the money out of do the withholding in January and February while they continue to negotiate, and at some point they will make sure that the tax cuts get extended. They'll also try to avoid the spending cuts in some way by, reinstituting the spending in Congress. So this thing is a farce because the reason they set it up in the first place was to make sure that they got serious about cutting spending and reducing the deficit, and whether that was through a combination of tax increases and spending or just a massive amount of spending cuts. But they'll avoid it, or in one way or another, whether they avoid it by the end of the year or not. It's not going to be a situation where all of a sudden there's a big reduction in the annual deficit and there's a big reduction in the overall deficit, and there's a big reduction in the amount of unfunded liabilities.
There's an interesting question that many people have asked me, and I wanted to get your take on it, Louis, and that is, okay, great. Our country is $15, $16 trillion in debt, and these are just numbers that are obviously going up, and nobody actually has the accurate number. Some are saying that it could be 80, 90 trillion with Medicare and everything else that's out there. But, they're like, well, we've been, continuing to do much of the same year over year, so it's just a number. What does it matter? What is your take on, that thought that, we can just continue going down this path, and that it really is just a number?
Well, there is some credibility to that. If you reach the point where you realize that you can never pay back $100 trillion, what's the point of even raising taxes? What's the point of even cutting spending if you know the bulk of it's going to be paid for by printing money as opposed to raising revenue through taxes? So I think that the whole thing is ridiculous because now they're sticking on tax the rich. That's got to be, on the Democratic side, a non-starter if they don't tax the rich. And that also indicates that people are willing to give up their fellow citizens in terms of, go and take their money because it's for the good of the country. But what they don't realize is that somehow they feel that the government is better off with that money. They overlook the waste, fraud, abuse. They overlook, well, maybe the government doesn't need that money. It just makes them feel better that now, okay, well, at least someone's paying for it, and they feel like, well, the deficit is going down because we've taxed these people. And the other thing they don't realize economically, if you look at the Laffer curve, is that when you tax anybody, at some point, you actually get less tax revenue, even though you raise the rates, because they start being less productive and they start making less money as a result. They stop hiring people, and therefore you actually lose tax revenue when you raise tax rates.
You're listening to Real Estate 360 Live. I'm your host, Ryan Sloper, joined by my guest, Louis Cammarosano, the general manager of HomeGain. Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a great point. It's like, okay, great. We've now decided that we want to tax the rich. We want to try to bring in more tax revenue. But who's holding Congress and everybody else accountable for that money, all that extra money just going to go to knock down the debt? You don't think they're going to find some other creative program to throw that money at? I mean, there's no such thing as, you bring a dollar in and knock down the dollar of debt that they have over there. They don't understand that concept. That
and you couldn't even bring in enough money to do it anyway.
Right.
Given
I guess
$100 trillion that's owed.
I guess it's fun for them to talk about because they need something to talk about. You know what I mean? But at the end of the day, regardless of what happens, I've been giving that a lot of thought. And these numbers, I mean, they're so far gone at this point that it doesn't matter what they do, they're not going to be able to get themselves out of the mess. So, with Geithner throwing out that he feels like the president should be able to just unilaterally raise the debt ceilings, because to be honest, they're running out of options, Louis. They're grasping for anything. They don't really know what to do.
There's one option, and it's printing, and that's what they're going to do. And they
don't want to tell the public that. They don't want to just come out and say, hey, the only way that we're going to be able to continue pace of what we've been doing is to continue to print money. And eventually,
excuse me, Ryan, but it's not just print money to pay off our creditors, to pay off the Chinese, the Japanese, and the holders of U.S. bonds. It's actually to print up money to actually buy the debt from ourselves and pay for it. And that's where it's really ridiculous.
You wouldn't even think that would be constitutional to be able to do that in the first place. You know what I mean? For you to be able to buy your own debt. I mean, it's kind of.
They don't. It's technically it's a Federal Reserve. It's an independent bank that's buying it.
Yeah, it's an independent bank that just happens to be like somehow mysteriously linked to our federal government and backstop everything that they've ever done. So, I mean, it's one of those crazy things, and I think that's the way that they get around it. And I guess the Federal Reserve, I mean, you would think, do they really have hundreds of trillions of dollars at the Federal Reserve? I don't think so.
Exactly. In fact, you couldn't go through the debt ceiling if there wasn't somebody there to buy it, and the Federal Reserve is the buyer of last resort. And now the Federal Reserve, as you and I have talked about, is really the buyer almost of all resort. They're buying about 70% of the debt issued by the United States.
Yeah, they're buying that, and they're having
with money printed out of thin air.
Exactly,
not out of their reserves.
And much of the money that's been pushed out there, yet we have not actually see it circulate, into the public's hands. It's just numbers that are sitting on banks' balance sheets.
That's why we don't have price inflation reflected in prices of finished goods.
Absolutely. And at some point that money will start to trickle out, and when it does, that's when we will start to see that inflation. And that is kind of, where we don't know the timeline for that, but it just seems like every day we're getting closer to it. Obviously, I'm sure that the Fed and Congress and the President, they have some sort of master plan in mind of how they're going to continue to operate this masterful scheme. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. Stay right there, guys. When we come back, we're going to go over the Freddie Mac survey that shows the last 12 consecutive months of mortgage interest rates below 4%. Stay right there.